According to Billboard, the Beatles hold the record for the most number one singles at 20. Although there have been many other popular artists and bands over the years, none have surpassed the Beatles, even though they broke up 53 years ago, which speaks to the significance of the band. My credentials for talking about the Beatles are that I'm a big Beatles fan, and I even went to a Paul McCartney concert. He was one of the Beatles. And I think it's important for you guys to know about this because of the big impact they made on music and pop culture. And my goal is that you will know a little bit more about the Beatles by the end of this speech. So first we're going to talk about the individual Beatles members, and then we'll talk about their music, and then the influence that their music had on music today. So the four Beatles are John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison. John Lennon played the rhythm guitar, and he was part of a songwriting partnership with Paul. He had a troubled childhood and would sometimes write about this in his music. In the early 70s, he joined the peace movement against the Vietnam War, and he wrote the song Imagine, which some of you may know. Unfortunately, he was tragically assassinated in 1980, and he died at only 40 years old. Paul McCartney played the bass guitar, and he was a co-writer with John. They wrote most of the Beatles' music and wrote songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand, Hey Jude, and Yesterday. And Paul wrote about his personal experiences as well, although his songs tended to be more optimistic than John's songs were. He also spearheaded the Beatles' transition into more innovative and psychedelic music. Oh, did I get everything? Later, he had a very successful solo career. He's still alive today at 81 years old, and as I mentioned, I saw him last year in concert. George Harrison was the youngest Beatle, and he played lead guitar. He was not a songwriter at first, but in the later years of the Beatles, he developed his own songwriting skills and wrote some of the Beatles' greatest hits, such as Here Comes the Sun and Something. He was more spiritual, and in the late 60s and 70s, he was more into Hinduism. Unfortunately, he died in 2001 due to lung cancer. Ringo Starr was the oldest Beatle, and he played the drums. He joined the group last, but he was the perfect fit for the band as he was known as the best drummer in Liverpool, which is the city where all four Beatles are from. His catchphrase is peace and love, which is part of the caption of almost every Instagram post he makes. He is 83 years old today. So there's a little bit about the individual members. So now let's talk about their music. The Beatles' first single, Love Me Do, was released in October 1962, according to Rolling Stone. Their first album, Please Please Me, was released the following year. So the Beatles' first 5 albums were good, but fairly similar, with more generic love songs such as I Wanna Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. Later in the albums Rubber Soul, which I have here, and Revolver, they began branching out more with their sound. They wrote about deeper subjects and began experimenting with unconventional instruments such as the Indian sitar. In 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. With the release of this album came a big change in the Beatles' music as well as how they presented themselves. While they all had kind of similar hairstyles during their first 7 albums, by the release of Sgt. Pepper's, they began growing out their hair and growing facial hair. This was a reflection of the changing times they were in, and it also influenced others to copy them. The musical content of Sgt. Pepper's was very psychedelic and experimental, which encouraged other musicians to replicate it. The rest of their albums were very innovative, one of the most memorable of them being Abbey Road, which I also have here. In this later period included songs such as Strawberry Fields Forever, Hey Jude, and Let It Be. Their last album of 13 studio albums, Let It Be, released in 1970, a month after the band publicly broke up. Now that I've given you a brief overview of their albums, let's talk about how they've influenced music. So the Beatles helped introduce the singer-songwriter. Often in the Beatles' time, there would be a young idol and they would sing songs that were written by a middle-aged or older writer or team of writers. The Beatles, starting with John and Paul, wrote their own words and melodies. As mentioned before, they began sticking to the formula of generic love songs, but later they branched out and they began writing songs about their own personal experiences in life and in love. In the song Nowhere Man, John wrote about his personal state of mind, and in the song Here, There, and Everywhere, Paul writes about his love for his girlfriend at the time, Jane Asher. Writing about more personal things was not as conventional, but the Beatles made it a more popular way to go and inspired other singer-songwriters to follow in their footsteps. They also inspired more creative and unique instruments and songs. An orchestra was used in the songs Eleanor Rigby and A Day in the Life, and a sitar was used in the songs Norwegian Wood and Tomorrow Never Knows. These experimentations with instruments helped the listener connect with the words more, as the instruments helped bring out the emotion in the song. The Beatles influenced both contemporary and modern day artists. Roger Waters, the bassist and songwriter for Pink Floyd, said about the Beatles, "It was okay to write about our lives and express how we felt. It gave me and my generation permission to branch out," which is quoted in You Discover. More recently, Lady Gaga said about Abbey Road, "It's so incredibly brilliant, an innate sense of joy. They really had that down," which was quoted in Gig Wise. So their influence and impact of their music is still felt today. In conclusion, the Beatles were made up of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. They had 13 studio albums and changed the music landscape. I hope you guys learned a little bit more about the Beatles. Shank ya.